Trich und Ehre, was ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab. Hier ließ sich reine taufen, dass der Mensch.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Matt Pegas.
And this is Dan Baltic.
And we are here today with Samuel Finlay, or Sam. You go by Sam, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sam's fine.
Sam Finlay, who a lot of our listeners probably know as the author of Breakfast with the Dirt Cult. He's a writer from Oklahoma who served in both Bosnia and Afghanistan. Breakfast with the Dirt Cult came out about, I was actually looking in the notes in prep for today, and we're coming right up on the 10-year anniversary of the book, are we not?
Yeah, we are.
Which is a fairly striking thing, but it's really kind of popped off over the last year and a half. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I was recently listening to y'all's interview with Delicious Tacos, and he'd mentioned how the way it is nowadays, there's like this sort of tail that happens, and he sold more books, since his, I guess in the past, the month that y'all recorded, than he had it as initial, and so
Right.
It's been kind of an interesting sort of slow burn, and I really appreciate everybody who's reviewed it or talked about it or bought it. It's I couldn't have done it without y'all, so thank you.
Absolutely. It's a great book. I'm not sure if you would ever describe it as a memoir, but for people who don't know, it's a pretty fair to say that it's fairly autobiographical account of your time in Afghanistan and the the time immediately preceding and following that period.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not terribly creative, so I was surrounded by all these people, and it's like I've got to this guy had said something or did something. I've got to capture this because it's just funny, or
Definitely
interesting or whatever. So
no,
it's all their dialogue was how they spoke,
And that really
so
shined through. That was like you're reading it and you're like, wow, this is like actually like you're actually there.
I'm grateful for that. That's kind of what I was hoping for.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
it's a fantastic book, and I mean that is, aside from being a military memoir, which obviously for a lot of us always holds some intrigue. What stands out to me about Dirt Cult, well, a lot of things stand out about it, and we'll get into those. But one of them is the verisimilitude, just the very much taken from life. You mentioned Delicious Tacos. I find it interesting. I'm not even sure if this is the right tone to strike about it, but it's what I found myself thinking on my first read through of the book. It's almost like if someone like a Delicious Tacos or even like a Michelle Welbeck wrote a war memoir, it would be this, because it has it's about something very serious, and it's about being at war, and there's that kind of some degree of that kind of action and those kinds of stakes, but nevertheless, as people like Benjamin Braddock in his review of it and Michael Anton have pointed out, it's also a book about Spenglerian decline, shall we say, and also, of course, as we'll get into more, the relations between men and women within the context of the 2000s and the 2010s. So I hope that isn't taken the wrong way, but I would definitely describe it as like you see the cover of the book and you're like, oh, this is a war memoir, but it's like that, but also has some of the same appeal as like a Delicious Tacos to me. And have you read much Tacos and other similar writers like that?
A bit. I came to him through his blog, and then later on, I had a gimmick account on Twitter, and I would keep up with his takes. But yeah, I'm honored to be in that company in that comparison. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's absolutely a compliment. It's the book goes places that you wouldn't necessarily expect a war memoir to go. And again, in a good way. I think that in some ways, like a lot of the most dramatic action from like a plot and character arc perspective happens not so much in Afghanistan, but in the end back in Canada, which I think a lot of people wouldn't expect, but I think it throws everything into relief in an interesting way, and makes the impact of some of the themes I think the book is exploring all the more strong.
Well, thank you on that. Whenever I started writing it, or just as I was writing it, I wanted to write the sort of thing that I wished had been there whenever I was thinking of enlisting.
Mm.
And whenever I was thinking about it, I was in college at the time, and I decided I was going to try to learn as much as I could about the Army to try to prepare myself. And so I went to the library, and I'm reading all these books, and whenever I was actually in it, it was completely at odds with it. You get this sort of in these memoirs or accounts of war or whatever, you get a really sanitized version of it.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's because you can't. I mean, it's like this is a book. You can't tell everything. But what they choose to put in, it's really scrubbed clean of a lot of the things the way it really is. So I wanted to try to write it warts and all, and even the good things or the funny things. They're just like this is if you're an infantry soldier and during the time that I was in, like this is kind of what life was like. And I've there are a lot of vets have responded positively to it. So I think it's a kind of chase a rabbit for a second. Paul Schrader once had a Vietnam vet come up to him, from what I heard. Whenever I guess he wrote Taxi Driver, and some vet had come up to him and said, "You stole my story," and Schrader said, "You must think you're terribly unique." He talked to a lot of veterans, and a lot of them had those sort of experiences, and he drew from that. So I think there's nothing really unique about me, and I hope that I don't know that a lot of people can see themselves or just like this is what that moment in time was like. So
I know what you mean with some of those other war stories because, like, I've read Black Hawk Down, I've read Dispatches, and like they do a very good job of portraying the actual conflict, but not so much in diving into the minds of the men that fight it. And I think, and if I'm not putting words in your mouth, I think that's kind of what you set out to do and did do with Dirt Cult, is to, explore not just the war, but the effect of the war on the man and society on the man.
yeah, because that all that stuff's happening at the same time. And like for instance, my old squad leader, it became kind of a running thing in that you could kind of tell his attitude based upon what was going on with his wife. Like Sergeant Bronson's being especially salty, and he's being real angry or whatever. Like him and his old lady got into a fight or something. Or you guys would go down range, and they might get deer jawned or something. And so all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And and I get, if somebody's wanting to learn about a war, they don't want to hear about somebody's emotional stuff or, if, these genres or whatever exist for a reason. But I wanted to try to tell a little bit or try to make it as real as possible. And in the real world, that stuff's just together. It's tangled up.
Yeah.
And it's a mess.
Well, what's interesting about your book is that it strikes a balance between in trying, I think, to portray things as truthfully and sometimes just as simply as possible. Or not as simply, you know what I mean? Like just as straightforwardly, as it really was. It achieves an interesting balance between a lot of things. Because I don't know if it's a problem, but like what I found in a lot of not only war memoirs but also, of course, movies and TV shows is they're kind of usually they're either all about the action and the heroism, which is okay in its own place, or there's something like the book The Things They Carried, which as I recall Bronze Age Pervert had very colorful words for when you were on his pod. I haven't read that book since high school. I remember enjoying it, but I can see why someone like that would be critical of it. It's definitely like a liberal book, and it's an anti-war book, but that leans very much into the emotional side. I remember enjoying some of that. But what's interesting about your book is that it's not. I mean, I'm actually curious if you describe it as an anti-war novel or not. If that's maybe that's not a simple, yes or no answer, but it is that. But also at other moments, and Bat pointed this out on the podcast as well. It portrays moments of valor and greatness, over there. Like it's not one thing. It's not like a red state, war story to make people feel good about our foreign policy at all. It's the opposite of that. But it's also not a simple like anti-war liberal tract either. It's somewhere in between. Does that resonate?
Yeah, yeah, it because it's not an anti-war because I don't think you can have an anti. I guess how do I rephrase it here? It's not anti-war because you can't have a world without war.
Right.
And
Right.
it's
Exactly. Yeah.
there's y'all. I was listening to y'all's conversation with Geo,
Mhm.
and he was talking about y'all were talking about art and how it kind of gets mingled up with politics, and there's kind of what constitutes guys right-wing art, and that there's something I guess that transcends, and you're accepting it. You're looking at the wreckage of empire or whatever, and the guy just says yes. Whereas with leftism, it presupposes that you can attain this sort of engineered society where we can apply scientific principles to human affairs, and we can have the utopia. Or and as I agree that Jonathan Bowden had said that this is kind of an adolescent wet dream.
Yeah.
And so it's like this is just a part of the human condition, and sometimes these things, are you get cross-threaded with individuals or groups of people, and conflict arises, and this is kind of a microcosm of how that plays out as I saw it. Um,
Yeah.
and so like you for me like there you can't really have there's not going to be a world without war, and so it's just like this is what it looked like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's I think that gets at the heart of what I was trying to get at there. Basically, it's not, and you've written about this in Dirt Cult, and then you've elaborated it upon it, on some of your podcast appearances, some of the articles you've written for IM 1776. You're critical, of course, as we all pretty much in this sphere are, of a lot of America's foreign policy and a lot of just what America has become, including in our wars. However, it's founded on that, call it Heraclitean if you want, or maybe even call it a little bit Baathist, perhaps. That basic, that fundamental. Some would call it right wing, but or some would call it just the domain of people who are actually red pilled on the way things work. That basically that things are founded in war and conflict, and this is an immutable part of the human experience, and one that's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think along with that comes the parts in your book where it's not so much that you're being pro-war in those moments, but there's this, and this maybe gets into the title of your book a little bit, that notion that war, whatever the war is, even if it's, whether it's Afghanistan or the legions of Rome, that you are being initiated into some kind of fundamental cult of the human experience, to be able to fight and, hopefully succeed. Um, just there's an understanding of war as one of those fundamental elements of the human experience in your book that, and there's that notable scene when they're in the choppers, and it's like, you feel almost like a pagan god out for vengeance, and it sure beats a day in the office. Like there's still, even as critical of the establishment and times of the war as your book is, it's still balanced by that fundamental notion of what war is. And does that resonate?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's you mentioned the title, and that's kind of what I was driving for with it, because it's kind of an esoteric title. It sounds weird, but I remember whenever I was going through this phase where I was reading everything I could about the military and combat arms, I came across this phrase warrior cult, and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of got lodged in my brain because you get around these guys, and you didn't know each other, maybe until a few weeks ago or maybe a year, and you're going to be going to the other side of the world, and if you get in a situation, air support's going to be a long time coming, and it's just y'all in Indian country, and all you have is each other, and suddenly things matter in a way that they don't, and you come to depend upon people, and you try to be someone that people can depend upon, and like that really brings out something, and that's
Right.
there's
Yeah.
magic in it.
You might even say, and I think someone like Bap, someone like Ernst Younger, even myself, although I have absolutely nothing close to any experience like this, given, from my vantage point, it would seem that, maybe this is a cliche point, but obviously war can bring out terrible things in people, and war itself may be hell at times. But I think it's fair to say that war also brings out the best in people, and in particular, men, or that it brings out these qualities that are what we most admire in men and in masculinity.
But yeah, and you can't have one without the other in a way, I think, or at least within the context of war and what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Knowing that you're going to be going into something and things are going to get ugly. You'll have some guy telling you that look to your left, look to your right. This person will not be here at the end of the mission, type of thing. Where you're going to be people are going to be losing limbs of their life, and you're going to be going to do this thing, and it's going to be ugly, and you'll be remembering it for the rest of your life. Um, that if you're going to survive that and see that other people do as well, and accomplish your objectives, you're going to have to rise above the fear of that or the pain of it, and you're going to have to confront that ugliness and try to bring something good out of it, or just simply survive, and that brings out something, and it's like this gets kind of to the heart of why we fight kind of in the first place. I mean, there's like a mystery that you have to participate in. So like with women with childbirth.
Yeah.
And that's sort of itself an initiation ritual into a sort of cult that unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, many men are never initiated. They're never initiated into the cult of the warrior, the cult of violence. And I mean, that is something that, once you kind of, at least this is what I gleaned from your writing, from other writing about war, once you've experienced that level of brotherhood, but also that level of kind of direct experience with the enemy, it changes you from what I understand. Again, this is not something I have experience with.
Yeah, but well, I mean, y'all have it in other ways, though. I mean, like, or y'all might be fathers, and if that's the case, you could tell me everything you know about fatherhood, and I could quote you chapter and verse back to you, and I could have memes, and I could have spreadsheets talking about all of the things that you explained, but I won't know it like you know it because you've experienced it, and that's just true with I guess y'all are lawyers or whatever.
I'm a lawyer.
You're a lawyer,
but neither of us are fathers yet.
Neither of us,
unfortunately.
but I think hopefully it's on the horizon.
Yeah.
But yes, I
well,
appreciate what you're saying. Yeah,
or even just of having a significant other, of loving a woman, little things like that you pass through, and it's, I mean, that's why we create art. I mean, because it's like there's something here it's significant in ways that you don't understand completely. You just know that it is.
And you just know that it is, and then you experience that, and then you can encapsulate it in a book like Breakfast with the Dirt Cult, and then that gives other people some kind of idea of it, in a non-trivial way. Like, I think that, again, I've read some other military books and obviously seen movies, TV shows, whatever, but that kind of more initiatory, personal hero's journey element definitely came across more in your book than any other book that I've read on similar topics. And I think in some ways I kept running in my notes, and I'm a big fan sort of of coming of age novels as a genre. Obviously your novel isn't about like a boy becoming a man, but maybe it's about a man becoming a true man. There is that sort of the narrative arc is very much of that coming of age sort, where someone goes through something and is strengthened for it. I mean, does the notion of coming of age, do you think, speak to the novel, or is that too?
Well, no, because
juvenile? Or
well,
yeah.
yeah, because that was, I mean, there was, there's elements of that, and it's and some of it I actually kept out of the book just because I would think like this is just seems kind of cliched. I need to, I don't want to play this up, but it like that was it just kind of worked out that way, because I was a guy in my early 20s at the time,
Yeah.
and we were seeing the end of whenever I enlisted, Clinton was still president.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so there was this transition over to the Bush era, and the end of the end of history, and the
Mhm.
beginning of the global war on terror, which is just about as lame a name as you could think. Um, but it so there were all these weird changes that were happening in the world, and I got to have this front seat to it. We were on the world. Me and my buddies, we'd go down to New York City because one of them was from Staten Island. We were on the
Oh,
World Trade
nice.
Center just a couple of months before 9/11.
Wow. Yeah.
So there was just kind of I guess a happy accident, or at least an accident.
Mhm.
And there's this sort of comedy of errors, maybe is a better way to put it. That was just that was my life, and that's kind of what I saw within and without.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And it's one of the things that I highlighted in the book is that it really is a period piece in a lot of ways, and it captures that 2000s moment. The book is basically set what from like 2004 to 2007 or so, or I guess, but with references to some earlier stuff as well. It captures that decade really, really well. I think I might have frozen up. Can you guys hear me?
No, I
Yeah,
hear you.
Okay,
yeah.
froze
You're
up for a
good.
second. Yeah, anyway, it captures that decade really well. And this is a kind of weird comparison, but we just did this episode on Entourage, which Sam
Yeah,
you
Which you
you
may
you
have
highlighted
watched.
as liking. I wouldn't bring this up if you hadn't highlighted it.
yeah.
But I was thinking about that, and I like that episode Dan and I did, and we kind of were talking about the show. And for people who haven't heard it, we talked about the show Entourage, which was on from like 2004 to 2011, I think, and the way it kind of encapsulated that, yeah, sort of that end of history moment. There was like a relative normalcy, but things are sort of starting to slide, and then there's of course the economic crisis and everything, and it kind of the show sort of moves from this moment of relative innocence to a sort of cold hangover of waking up into like a much less forgiving world economically and socially, and in a really strange way. I feel like Breakfast with the Dirt Cult, taking a very different topic, not layabouts doing nothing in Hollywood, but rather war. Nevertheless, it kind of charts that time period in a similar way, where there's an innocence at the beginning, and then at the end there's a sort of total disillusionment. So I don't know if that's too flippant of a comparison, but I did just want to highlight that I do think another one of many reasons to read Breakfast with the Dirt Cult is that I think it's a really good encapsulation of the 2000s as a decade.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that because I started writing the book. Well, I enlisted back in 2000, and I got out in 2005. So you're
Mhm.
seeing, up until then. After I got out, I wound up leaving to go travel around the world and all that kind of stuff. But I spent a month at home, and one of the things that I did was I watched Entourage. One of my brothers he got into it, and I remember watching it, and there was that feel, that vibe that was very much kind of that time, that because you're coming off of Sex in the City,
Right.
and it's these are guys during that time, and this is kind of how it was. This is like hookup culture, kind of like you're seeing this representation of it, and the Great Recession hadn't happened yet,
Right.
and
Exactly.
it was just that was that moment. So yeah,
It, it
that's
was
when that
this
happens.
moment for men before the dating apps and before the recession where like on our pod, like a certain type of man, maybe it wasn't the most moral life, maybe it was certainly wasn't the most moral life,
Hmm.
but they enjoyed a sort of high water mark, I would
Mm-hmm.
say.
Yeah, and it was taken as sort of normal. Which
Yeah.
Exactly.
after I had listened to y'all's episode, I went and watched. I watched the movie on Amazon. I
I haven't
watched it,
seen
and
it yet, but I will.
I,
Yeah.
I haven't seen it either.
it it's funny because it's of that time, but we're no
Yeah.
longer there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
there were little elements like that, for instance, one of the I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but one of the subplots is there's an investor from Texas who winds up being a thorn in the side of the fellas, and and I kind of wonder how much of this is a hangover from the Bush era, and because this guy's a Texan, and he's carrying a gun, and you first see him riding a horse, and he's just a little bit of a nuisance, and they kind of look down on him because the guy's kind of it winds up being a blustering idiot. But it's like there was just that kind of like this feels like Bush era type stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting because well, one thing, and this is definitely something I wanted to highlight, that our listeners who haven't read your book will appreciate is like there really is some very, and I know this is an overused term, but there's some very red pill stuff about women in it and about dating and about the sexual marketplace and the state of modern women, and all of that is very well received. This is both kind of some sort of more philosophic asides at the beginning of the novel, and then what ultimately happens. The protagonist Tom Walton and his ill fate in love sort of reflects some sort of truths that would be talked about by someone like Hartiste or Roosh or our good friend on this pod, Matt Forney. And I do want to actually ask you more about all that in a second, but I just wanted to also add, when you're reading those sections about, there's a really notable section in Dirt Cult where they're at a bar, I think in like Watertown, like near Fort Drum, right? And
that's Watertown.
Yeah, exactly. We can talk about Watertown too, maybe in a bit. I think Dan and I both have some experience there, but basically just kind of reflecting on the state of modern women and the relative degeneracy of it all. It's not that I'm nostalgic for that period per se, but kind of as we talked about with Entourage, it's like even that seems better than what it is now. Like even that was all bad with the bar hookups and all that, but at least there was a playing field. So it's like in a weird way you can almost get nostalgic for something that like wasn't even good in its time, but like things are even more atomized now. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there's definitely something that feels dystopian about the way things are nowadays.
Yeah.
That wasn't there then, and I don't know how much of that is just internet and cell phone type of stuff suddenly becoming popular, but there was still it was different.
Exactly. And like, and by the way, I'm not saying like let's make it the 2000s again. I think at least in some critical ways we're here now because we were there then. Like it's common enough dissident right talking point. But nevertheless, there is still that nostalgia. Like, I mean, just not to spoil too much, but one of the central, and perhaps all of the stuff with Afghanistan aside, maybe the central conflict and story arc of the novel has to do with the protagonist Tom Walton's relationship with a stripper that he meets in Canada named Amy, and in some ways it's almost like a romance, not that it's a romance novel, but like that it is a very passionate affair, but let's just say that it doesn't necessarily end well. And that's and there's X, Y, and Z reasons for it, and like obviously, maybe a strip club isn't ultimately the best place to meet a wife.
Yeah.
But even within that, it's like not even like that. The fact that could even happen, that could have even been a possibility, almost seems like a product of a bygone era. I mean, that kind of just like serendipity and people connecting in that way.
No, that's true.
Ill-fated or otherwise, just feels like it doesn't so much happen anymore. But maybe we're beating a dead horse with this 2000s thing. But you know what I mean? Like the book, I mean, all I'm needing to highlight is that the book somehow it is a sort of Spenglerian tragedy about the decline of a society, but even within that, there was a glimmer of something even then that I don't think we quite have anymore in the same way.
Well, that's tall praise to get lumped in with these the Spenglerian tones and whatnot.
I think I stole that from Benjamin Braddock's this novel, but I think it is accurate. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that because I think it's just I heard someone once say, and I'm going to butcher this thing, so I'm not going to bother trying to quote it, but that you shouldn't try to make conservative art or right-wing art. You should just tell the truth,
right?
Exactly. Or just convey what you see about the human experience, and I think that's true. And I also think going to criticize myself. I know for a fact that I took liberties with the reader. Because there's times where I shoehorn, like you mentioned, the bar scene. That's one of those scenes where it's like we're writing it. I know I'm stepping out of the story too much. Like I wound up ranting for like 3 or 4 pages, but it's way I saw it. Like this is probably the only time I'm going to say anything to people.
Right. Oh no,
And so like I'm just gonna like throw it all out. Like I'm just gonna rant at you, the reader, for about 5 pages. So stick with me.
I think it's fantastic because we see how people who make it their bread and butter to just not write novels, but rather tackle those issues head on. We see that they end up kind of more in the crosshair, like someone like Roosh. I'm not defending everything he's ever said or done, but like he did sort of end up in the crosshairs because he was the pickup artist, anti-woman guy, you know, whereas someone like Delicious Tacos, even who's controversial, but not as much as Roosh or even you, it's like you write something that's honest and that's really enjoyable to read, and that, you know, anyone with empathy, even I think even liberals with empathy, you know, reading this would be like, oh, this stuff hits. You know, you can kind of couch the criticisms in the story. I think it makes it more effective. And, you know, maybe it's not to everyone's taste, but I really like sort of philosophic novels and stories. And so, you know, a little bit of a digression, and all of it is entirely relevant to the stuff that goes on plot wise. I mean, it was one of the elements of the book that I liked the most and one that made it stand out.
Well, thank you. And you read books, and so much of the narrative is dominated by the left. And so you would read these books, and these authors would go on, and you know they're giving you a message that's supposed to translate into some sort of political mindset or sensitivity. They're trying to work you. And I'm thinking, like, you know what? I'm going to give y'all a dose of your own medicine. Like this is where I'm going to cut a promo on you, and like you're going to have to deal with what I think. So it's maybe I went a little too far, I think, but I feel like I needed to get it out.
I think
this is like my only time to talk to Joe, kind of, you know, like the 18-year-old who's thinking to enlist. So I want to try to like, you know, for my kind of guys, the grunts, I want to at least, they might not have ever read Toynbee, but they can at least get my take on how he applies now.
I think from a narrative point of view, it really does work because it helps, you know, further, even if it's digression, it helps further get into the mind of Walton. And like, that's always important. So like, I think in writing, you never really make a misstep as long as you're still in the mind of the character, because like, that's the point. You're just following the character around. And like the plot is, you know, the plot is where the character goes.
Well, thank you. That was because that's stuff that kind of obsesses. I say kind of. It obsesses me, and it has been since I was a kid. I remember. Have y'all ever read From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzun?
No, I've heard the title, but tell me about it.
There's a great interview you can find where he sits down with Charlie Rose around the time that the book was released, and he wound up getting a Pulitzer, which is telling because this is, you know, early mid '90s whenever he wrote this book, and I don't think he would have gotten it nowadays.
No,
he's this grand old man of letters, and he sits down with Charlie Rose, and and Charlie right out the gate just says decadence. You know, it's like a stripper name. Welcome to the stage, decadence. You know, but he says decadence, and Jacques Barzun's just this grand old man of letters, and he's an old man now. He's got a like plaid suit or blazer, and he's just like, it's a frightening word, isn't it? And Charlie says, absolutely, and he says, but it doesn't have to be. Decadence just means falling away, and afterwards you get Renaissance. But I mentioned that because whenever I was in college, you know, I didn't have much money, but I would peruse the books, and I found that book, and I just out of curiosity started reading it. And every time I couldn't buy it because it was just really expensive for me at the time. But every time I went into the bookstore, I would read a little bit of it. Because this was around the mid '90s. You know, the Monica Lewinsky scandal thing was going on at the time, and so like this, you know, and I'm from Oklahoma, and I'm dealing with issues of faith and stuff, and the way I was raised, it seems like it's completely being at war. It's the whole society in which I live is kind of at war with the way I was raised and was normal up until relatively recent until then. And I don't understand why things are the way they are. And he's drawing off of the Spinglers and the Toynbees and Ibn Khaldoons and all these people, but he was the first I'd read who had mentioned them. And so this thing it's rolling around in my head, and you'd often go to the bar, and you're looking to be like Entourage and raise hell and drink, and and get with girls or whatever. But there's also a part of you that thinks like, I'm watching something fall apart.
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't like it, and I'm a part of it, and I
And
don't
even
like that
more
about
so
me.
now. Like even like obviously back in the early 2000s, when the period you're writing about, yeah, that level of sexual licentiousness that represents a sort of falling apart. But I would argue that today you go to bars and you see everyone on their phone, and in a Bappian way, that's even worse.
Yep.
That's even you don't even have people fucking anymore. You have
Yeah.
people looking at their phones.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's why the Watertown bar scene is one of the, there's many memorable scenes in the novel, and that's one of them to me. Yes,
Was that set in? I'm sorry, Matt. Was that set in Watertown, the bar? Because you were in Fort Drum. I didn't realize that the bar was in Watertown.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh wow. Okay.
that was one of the dive bars that we would
Nice.
all the off post all the soldiers go.
On my father's side, I have family from Watertown. Just a whole generations of people who came from Watertown.
I feel bad for them. For the people from,
absolutely.
Because you've got a military installation right on your doorstep, and it completely warps everything around it.
Oh well, like Fort Drum now, that's a godsend for them because unfortunately, the way the economy shook out with globalization, their industry and everything is just hollowed out, terrible.
The Rust Belt starts
there.
Yeah, I'm from
Fort Drum being nearby is that's great because that brings business.
Yeah,
I'm from Syracuse originally, so I'm also very familiar with the area. We used to go up through Watertown on the way to Canada all the time, that you really neither here nor there with regard to your novel. Other than that, I did recognize that setting, it's not really what Breakfast with the Dirt Cult is about. But we actually Dan and I talked about it on a previous episode with wriiter Caleb Cadell, who wrote a sort of Rust Belt set novel. The Rust Belt really does start in that corridor of upstate New York. In my opinion, that's kind of neither here nor there with regard to the novel, but it is interesting.
And there's a lot I liked about it. Because we'd get off post, and some of the boys would live, maybe a half hour off post, and just to kind of get away from everything, and they'd throw a party, and you'd go out there, and this could be like Oklahoma, it's just like you get close to the military installation though, and suddenly this is where the people fight for Globo Homo. It's different. It helps the local economy, and but it's like, man, I feel bad for anybody who's got to like raise a family, because you go to the mall or whatever, and you've got a bunch of drunken infantry soldiers who are just acting up and being a fool, or you're getting hit. Your daughter's getting hit on by some guy, and you're like God, these people.
That's so funny. But
one thing about that area, it's like obviously, as you note in the book, it's like in the winter buried in snow. So that gives way, I know in Watertown historically to an extreme amount of drinking. And I assume being a military man in an area that's buried in snow all winter, there must have truly been some epic acts of imbibement.
Oh, good Lord. It got grim.
Captured in the novel, yeah.
It got grim. I was initially supposed to go. I was initially tasked to. I got my orders to go to the 82nd Airborne at an airborne school, and I was really excited about that. And I'm thinking, all right, I'm gonna wear the maroon beret, and I'm gonna have that cool thing they put on their shoulder, and I'm gonna have jump boots in my Class A's. I'm gonna be badass jumping out of planes. And sure as you're born, I'm in line, and they call my name, and my orders had got changed 10th Mountain. And I thought, oh hell! And this is the winter time, and you get off the plane, and everything is it's gray, and it's almost noon, and it's like darker than 10 foot up a coal miner's ass, and it's like Hoth without the charm, and you're just thinking, oh my God, what did I get into? But you eventually you bond with people, and you have fun. We had guys who would we had a guy who one time he jumped out of a 2-story window into a snowdrift, or they would get drunk and they took apart an ironing board and then went to this hill and slid and used it like a sled.
Oh, totally.
Everybody drunker than who shit the shower on this beat up, stripped down ironing board on an iced up hill, and it got out of control. But in a way, that was you make your fun where you can.
Definitely.
Also, I don't know if you found this to be the case, but when like you're buried in snow and you're in a bar, like I find that the women are maybe a little bit hornier, a little bit more.
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah.
You know, there's that kind of trapped element, and it's like, you know, I don't know why exactly.
Yeah, cabin fever's real. That's no joke.
Oh yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I live in Los Angeles now, so better weather, but less of that. But anyhow, but back on the bar topic, that's you know, it is a really memorable scene because not only is it the philosophic reflection about the state of women, whatever, but it's that feeling of witnessing something falling apart and feeling that you yourself are part of it in some small way. That's one of, I mean, there's that scene in the bar, but in some ways, not to overextend that, but in some ways, that's the entire novel, and with the war. Even is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, yeah, it is.
I think that's, on my reading of it, that's kind of what feels like. There's a lot of moving pieces here. Again, it's not an anti-war novel. It's not, you know, pacifistic or liberal in that way, but it is this sense of being, you know, on this sort of sinking ship and having very, very meaningful and rich experiences on that sinking ship, but also kind of being aware the entire time that the ship is in fact sinking. And it creates this extremely poignant mood. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Y'all are gonna have to start trolling me or criticizing this stuff at some point. I'm very humbled. I really appreciate the words. Yeah. There's earlier we were talking about the whole rite of passage kind of part of the book, and there were things I cut out, and one of them was that, like, I'm coming, as I said, I'm coming out of the Bible Belt, and my brothers would joke that, we were born on a Wednesday and in church on Sunday. And like this is a big part of what I think about things in life, and I was kind of like, again, this is the stuff I left out of the book because it's sort of cliched. I don't think people would believe it nowadays, and it's kind of embarrassing, I guess, but like I was abstinent. And so, like, I'm in an infantry environment, and I'm trying to, like, not let on that I'm, I've never been with a woman, because then you're going to catch hell, and like, you're going to wind up in some like sleazy, off post, bordello or whatever, and like you just, so you got to like kind of pass it off. But like I didn't want to let on, but I was getting into my mid 20s, and I already got one deployment, and I'm about to go to another. And there's a good chance I'm going to be one of the people getting killed because I'm a team leader. And it's like, well, I think this place is a brothel, and so I'll, go through that. But also, whenever I first got there, a buddy of mine, we wound up being friends later. He said, you just sat there with this look on your face, like, leave me alone and don't talk to me. And because I felt like I was in jail, I enlisted thinking it was going to be this noble experience, and it's going to be these lantern-jawed warriors who are going to teach me how to be a man. And it wasn't like that. This was like a fraternity meets Boy Scouts meets I don't know what. It was just this weird sort of, again, to use the word dystopian, but there's an aspect of managerialism that walks hand in hand with the military, which brings up a book, Once an Eagle, which we might come back, or from Here to Eternity. There's like there were some post-war novels that touch on this stuff of just like how the military is this mechanism for managerialism that doesn't really get talked about. But you're in this environment, and I'm thinking, like, God, what did I do? I've got 4 years of this, and I would make compromises with myself. I remember I eventually started cussing, and then like I would try to like draw the line at blaspheming, but then eventually I do that. So by the time you meet my character, I guess, of the book, I've already made a lot of compromises.
Right.
You're about to witness me make another
more.
Yeah. And so that's, so whenever, I eventually, I would start drinking, which I never really drank, but when you're an infantry soldier and you want to fit in, you drink because again, it's a grim environment, and it's even more when you're alone. And there are, and not, it's not like everybody's just the bad guy in an after school special. They're like you. They're far from home and they're going through things, and drinking is one of the things that you can do together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in a place like Fort Drum where you're snowed in.
Yeah. Nothing else to do.
Yeah,
Might
and
as
you've
well
got
get drunk.
yeah, and whenever, and in some ways, it's even worse when they try to like help you. The military. Like we're all going to have this competition, or we're going to do this thing, and it's like this is this weird sort of almost Soviet kind of fellow comrades. We're all going to have fun now, kind of a thing, and you just
strength through joy.
Yeah, well, like BAP. One of the things I like about BAP's writing is this concept of own space.
Right. No.
And sure. you know that every aspect of your life is owned. Like you're literally wearing a uniform that's got not their yours. Name on it. Yeah. You are branded. You've got dog tags like an animal. Whenever you go into the shit, you're going to like write your blood type, on a piece of duct tape or whatever. There's a degree to which your entire life is occupied and it belongs to someone else. And then they can make arbitrary decisions at any point of, hey, you got to go do common areas, or, hey, it's 2 a.m. You need to go sweep the snow out of, the parking lot or whatever. And like, that's your life. And so you try to make your fun. But there's, and just, that age, you're pushing envelopes and things, and that era too. Because, World War II, Vietnam, or in the rearview mirror, and also we've got this new thing, and we don't really know what it's like, and maybe we're going to go die, so let's live it up. But there's all this thing that's kind of happening, and you're thinking like, I'm trying to have fun and make the best of the situation, but I'm making myself ugly. And a part of me likes it.
No, definitely. There you go on if you had more to say.
Oh no, I've taken a long way around the barn there. So I appreciate y'all hanging in with me.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of what I read is one of the major themes of Dirt Cult, kind of reflected in the final pages, where I found this moving, and we've already talked about similar ideas on the pod so far, but Walton reflects in that kind of final scene with the shower how he wanted to join the military because he thought it was an enclave and perhaps the last bastion even for masculinity within society, which resonated with me. I've never but I've never been in the military. I may have toyed with the idea at some point in high school, never that seriously, but whenever I thought about if I have done that, the reason would have been some kind of notion that I may not even have had words for at the time, but the idea of becoming a man by being initiated into that. And I guess the question, again, it's another question where maybe there's not a straightforward answer. But like, do you think the military can still be that enclave for masculinity, or is that a thing of the past? Or maybe it was never really like that, or somewhere in between. Is that dead, or I don't know.
I think there's a degree to which it's perennial. That anytime you have a military, you're going to have guys who are going to be attracted to it, or may serve it. And I think that's always going to be. In terms of kind of where we're at now, though, I think, going back to my man Barzoon, I think we're witnessing the death of the nation state. And I think the U.S. is an agent of that. It's sort of like a country in name only. It's global managerialism. That's what America's for. And when you're in the military, there's a guy named his handle's like Iraq 88 or whatever. He had a YouTube channel with an older gentleman, and they do gun reviews or whatever. And he was an Iraq vet. He did a great tweet thread about why men aren't recruiting. And there's just this sense like you're serving the administrative state. You're not really fighting for God and country, or or whatever. You're fighting for something that's ultimately opposed to you. And so
Yeah.
you go, if you're going to go into it, you're going to probably almost by default have a kind of mercenary attitude that I'm going to get something from this that I want. It's not because I love it. Going back to kind of the rite of passage for men and masculinity and all that. I think we're starting to explore it in other ways. You see, Tacos did. I guess he did boxing. Now he's doing BJJ.
Hmm.
You have a lot of guys who are getting into bodybuilding or MMA as well. And they're my buddy James LaFond. He never served in the military, but the guy he's out of Baltimore, and he's a writer, but he's also a retired supermarket worker, and so he had like 2 or 3 jobs, and by day he'd be working in a grocery store, and at night he'd be boxing, or he'd be doing blunted machete duels, or just fighting and doing crazy things. And I think what we're seeing is guys orienting, seeking kind of the mystery of violence or
Yeah.
of struggle in other ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's what part of what this corner of the internet is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's kind of going back to kind of like the whole perennial or traditional, whatever, or the whole red pill thing, like with hierarchies, like they're always going to be there, and people are going to find them and work this stuff out. But one of them is that the whole manor boon thing.
Yeah.
And men are always going to be at the forefront of any sort of order, because we have to, and there's really no option for us. We have to get out there and make do. We have to. Was it the NPC did a thread on like beating the earth for its energy? Like we have to do that. We have to struggle. We have to like make things happen. And that's just a thing men do. And
Mm-hmm.
Right now we're witnessing like I guess the beginning of something that'll eventually become founding fathers of something.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that
we hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you used the word perennial, because I think that describes it pretty well. Again, I read Dirt Cult, as a Spenglerian tragedy about this decline of the nation state, decline of American culture, decline of the American military towards something more just sheerly bureaucratic and managerial. And yet, it's not like a black pill novel, because there is that there is something that persists through all of it, even through a war where maybe we shouldn't have been in the entanglement. It still is the mystery cult of war, and there is still those great moments in the novel. There is, and I think this is kind of what's summed up in the final few pages. Like there is still that initiation still takes place. The mystery of violence, the mystery of romance and sex and marriage, even. Marriage isn't in the novel, but it is about men and women. There is, without being at all heavy-handed about it, it's like that light, that torch does carry on even through the decline, and that is the torch of not even like traditionalism, because it's not about like strictures or ways of life, but perennialism, the perennial concerns of mankind and of men and of these things that we strive for, even in the pause. Can still be found. And you were being earlier in the pod, Dan and I, being really down on the way things are. Maybe it's even worse than it was in the 2000s, but I still think absolutely there are still, human nature doesn't change. And there's dark elements of human nature, but there's also incredibly light and beautiful and masculine elements that I do think can still be accessed. But I think we're living at a time, in a very atomized time, of course, when we have to get really creative to sort of find those things. And honestly, just also to be frank about it, maybe they're not what they once were. Like yes, studying Brazilian jiu-jitsu is great, but like obviously it would have been better to be in a more like a true military unit fighting for a more authentic glory. Like that's better, but like we can still find these things, even if it's just like us alone in our houses and recording podcasts and doing martial arts. Like I think we have to be real. Like it's not, it is like there are bad things about a declining society, but like also there is that hope in in what we can still do, and the bonds we can still form, and the brotherhoods, and reading Bronze Age mindset or whatever the case might be.
Yeah. Well, we don't have it's that or what.
Right.
Like there's like I didn't know this until, like, I guess 10 years ago, but I guess within Catholicism, despair is a sin. And I thought that was kind of an interesting take. And I remember growing up in church, this one guy, they had this guest preacher, whatever, come to the youth group, and you're a kid, and you're hopped up on the Bible, and you're wanting to, like, you're on fire for the Lord, want to change the world or whatever. It, like kids are, and I remember this guy comes in and he cuts a promo on us. He says, God doesn't need you. He doesn't need this church. He doesn't need the youth group. And he, to kind of, humble us, because and you realize that, like, ultimately, like, there's things at work that are bigger than we are. And maybe we don't get to see the promised land. And maybe, we got the stink of Egypt on us, and it's just going to be like that for the rest of our lives. But, we get to play around in this wild in between. We get to, we're a part of the shipwreck, and we get to, there's moves we can make, and there's possibilities. And if we get so wrapped up in what's wrong and despair, it'll blind us to possibilities, because there's all kinds of stuff we can do. I mean, like right now we're talking, we might not have ever met otherwise. And there are all these people.
I'm sure we wouldn't have.
Yeah, and think of all the people in our circles. These are crazy smart people. 20 years ago, they'd have been shouting into the outer darkness, or they would have been completely alienated. But we've got these, like, esoteric archaeology things that we're learning about, or someone will do a post. There'll be some artwork that I'd never seen before that someone posts. And so there's or a book like mine would have not have gotten published had it not been for self-publishing. Like guys like I owe a debt to, you mentioned Roosh, also Matt Forney, and all the guys
Matt
who
Forney,
started.
big friend of the pod.
He also gave me one of my first reviews.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he's all of those guys. I owe a tremendous debt to them. And so I guess, to anybody, listening who feels like tapping out, don't. we need every swinging dick, to the left and right of us who can do anything worthwhile. Because like the manifest destiny, the sky's the limit. It's really bad now, but the glory is the struggle. So
to go back to your metaphor there, it's not that God needs you. It's more that you need God. Yeah. And so, like, we, like, none, to apply it to us, like any, contribution that we individually make, frankly, even as good as it may be, as good as anything that any of us does, it's not necessarily needed. But what is needed is this space. Like, we need each other. We need to be part of this thing.
Yeah.
That's my gloss on it.
And if you notice, it's guys.
Yeah.
Like it's whether this is sort of like the the story of the garden. Like, it's not something that's like just once true. Like, this is perennial. Men are always kind of like, we're tasked with being custodians of things.
The next new thing, finding the new, because women will always, want to cling to the status quo because the status quo is safe, and evolutionarily that makes sense because they need to protect their babies. Yeah. But it falls upon men to voyage, to conquer, to seek out to correct course on civilization, in fact, if that's what's needed. Yeah. And I don't think we'll go down that rabbit hole too far here.
No, but that is what we're
maybe some course correction is
we're not thinking up Turner Diaries scenarios here. I think what we're already doing, by not to pat ourselves on the back or rest on any laurels, but by creating cultural space, that we're already engaging in that in some way. It doesn't, it's not all Fed post stuff. Riding with despair is prohibited, as our friend
as Dane Haynes says. It's a great meme. He makes posters and t-shirts, and it's this t-shirt of this stick figure on the subway holding his head in his hands with a big stop sign, like X going through it, and it says "Riding with despair is prohibited."
It's a good. I think it's a good message, sort of for these times. And I'm glad you referenced Forney as well. Forney is responsible for publishing both Dan's and my debut novels. Dan's is coming out soon.
That's right.
Mine came out
A
about
couple of weeks.
a
Yeah.
year and a half ago. So no, Forney is great and has helped, I guess, all three of us, get our work out there. But I did want to ask, like, sort of, how did you come across this scene? And you're kind of an OG, as like you've been it's seemingly from what I've heard, you've been reading sort of the manosphere stuff for like since like 2010, 2011, which I mean it's a lot earlier than I came into it, certainly. But how did you sort of discover this stuff? How did I'm not asking like how you got red pilled per se, but like obviously there's a lot of as we talked about, a lot of stuff even in Dirt Cult, you said was influenced by people like Forney, Rouge, Artiste, and so I'm just kind of curious what your process, because I don't imagine you were reading that stuff at Fort Drum, but eventually you kind of found it, right?
No, yeah, actually, Forney's blog in Malafide that
Yeah.
actually played a role.
Oh wow.
I was in grad school at the time, and I'm going out of my mind because I've come off of a war, and I know what downrange looks like, and I'm getting all these eggheads throwing all this theory at me, and I know it's bullshit. You these people who are talking about IR theory or whatever. And I would love to see them go down range and talk to some like 20-year-old corporal who would just, who's been in country for a couple of months, and he's going to look at them like they fell out of a dog's ass. It's like, because this stuff it's really great on a dry erase board, but the real world's messy and it doesn't work like that. Anybody with a lick of sense can see this. But anyways, I'm stuck in this, like, what I find out is basically like graduate school in like liberal arts is pretty much a seminary for globo homo.
Yeah.
And like,
pretty much.
I'm getting this stuff straight out the tap, and it's just I don't know, I could rant on them all day long because there's just so much stuff where it's just like I got to get up and walk away, and like go walk around class. But anyways, my tire pressure monitoring system went off on my truck. I didn't even know I had a tire pressure monitoring system, but there's this thing on the dashboard kicks up, lets me know that my tire's out of pressure or whatever, and my tire's fine. But I'm thinking, like, what the hell is this safety gimmick doing on my truck? I don't want this. What do I got to do to remove it? And it's like, well, it's illegal to remove it. Like, well, who the hell's idea was this? And so, I get on the internet, and you know how it is. You sort of get into a fugue state, chasing down something, whatever question you got. And I wound up coming across the phrase transnational progressivism, which wound up leading me to an article that was linked in Malafide. And because Forney had aggregated all this different stuff from all of these different articles and disciplines, and it wasn't just one strict thing. He's just kind of chasing his curiosity as well, and bringing back stuff that he's seen that he thinks is interesting.
Yeah.
And because of that, now suddenly I'm like in the petri dish. I'm seeing all this different stuff happen at once.
That's how it happens,
Yeah, and you're thinking, like, and again, it's guys, who are like in the outer darkness trying to figure out what's wrong and what do I need to do about it. And there's all this discovery that's going on, or things that were lost that are being uncovered. And you're like, there's something here.
Absolutely.
And so I owe a debt to the Forneys and the Rouches and the Hartistes. And I wouldn't, Dirt Cult will not be, what it is, to the extent it's anything, worth reading. A lot of it is, I'm standing on their shoulders. And so
Fascinating. Yeah. No, that's why, as dated and in some ways alienating of a phrase as it is, like the red pill thing, it's always I've never fully departed from that meme, because when you get into this stuff, it is, as you said, it's like a petri dish. Like, you do plunge in, and it is often like one moment, and then you dive in further, but like you're never the same, which is why I think that metaphor kind of works. But no, obviously this podcast is dedicated to literature, quote unquote red pill literature, and platforming it, and we've talked a lot about Forney and Hartiste and sort of authors who've been influenced by them. What's interesting with you is that I think there's a kind of an explosion right now of a lot of people, a lot of guys writing this kind of literature, which is great. But you did do it. You're this whole thing is kind of a pioneer enterprise, but you're an early adopter, even of that, which is very cool. I mean, you wrote the kind of novel that a lot of people are now just starting to write and read, which is interesting. But not just to keep piling praise on you. I did think it would be interesting to talk a little bit, and we've already discussed a little bit about your sort of process of trying to get Dirt Cult published, because you didn't always plan on self-publishing it, correct? Like, you did actually send it out pretty widely.
Yeah, I didn't want to. There was still that stigma of vanity publishing. You self-published because you couldn't get published in a legitimate publishing house or whatever. And so like that was still the stink was still on that.
Hmm.
Um, and good Lord, back in 2005, I guess I had I bought a lap again, like this whole that time period. I remember not many guys having computers, nobody
Hmm.
having cell phones or whatever. And at
Yeah, yeah.
2004, I bought my first laptop, and I'm at Walter Reed, and I'm teaching myself. I'm not even teaching myself. I'm obsessed, and it's like I've got to get this thing out of my head. And I wound up without even really thinking about it, teaching myself how to type one-handed. And I can type one-handed now faster than I could with two back then. But it's you're obsessed and you've got this thing in your head, and you're like, I've got to get this out before while it's hot.
Yeah.
And I cranked out like a 400-page rough draft.
Oh wow.
There
Mm.
was a there was a guy named McKay Jenkins who wrote a book on the 10th mountain, and he was doing a veterans authors program. He was a contributor to it, and he was kind enough to take a look at it and make some suggestions. And he recommended his agent, and his agent wound up passing on what I had. And I a couple of times approached him, and then he just pretty much declined it altogether. And so I got the literary marketplace book, and it was for the kids that don't know, it's basically it's a website database of all the literary agents and whatnot, but it's in a book form, which is
I bought
it's a
that a
website made
long
out of
time
trees
ago.
basically. Do what?
I bought that a long time ago.
Yeah,
I
so you know what
too
I'm
was
talking
in
about.
the business of trying to get
Yeah,
novels published.
yeah, you're it's funny how antiquated this stuff is now, but I remember getting that and just going down the list of anybody who I thought would be interested and sending them a query, which in doing queries really helps with your writing, I think.
Oh, true. Yeah, it does to some, and also to think about like, well, what is my novel really about? How do
Yeah,
I condense it into a couple of paragraphs?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like that's helpful. The responses from mainstream publishing are not helpful, but that is.
Yeah, yeah, which was again, it's educational, and I did with this thing where I joked with my mom. It's the Great American Mail Out, where like every couple of months I would send out, good Lord, maybe 100, maybe 70 something to 100 queries, and I would they most of the time you wouldn't hear anything, but sometimes I'd get a rejection, or sometimes somebody would want to look at it and I need to pass.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion. I've never worked in the publishing industry, but I've worked adjacent, shall we say, to some industries where people get like submissions all the time. I am of the opinion. I don't know if this was. I think at some point there maybe even so with literature. I don't know, but like at some point people did just send stuff out and people picked it up. I don't think I'm of the opinion it happens like not at all anymore.
Yeah, the
Like
death of the slush pile.
yeah, like
Hmm.
people still for whatever reason, different companies and organizations still have the slush pile. But I am of the opinion that without it, there may be some exception out there, but by and large, um, the modus operandi at any company with a slush pile is like we have that for the optic of it, but like it's all rejections, and now it's all about you know it's people with like so big social media followings are approached basically to write about what they want you to write about. And I think maybe at a certain point we did kind of have more of a culture where you could kind of get a foot in the door just by sending something out. But I think for better or
Yeah.
worse, we're past that. Now, some of that might have to do with the fact that there is less of a stigma for self-publishing. Like there's almost this reflexive understanding that people can just do that now, and that's a worthwhile path. But I do think that I'd have to like look at the data, whatever. I don't even think the data exists, but basically that we've moved even more firmly away from you know submission culture where you could actually submit stuff and toward hopefully productively towards self-publishing. But
I think
uh
you're right.
yeah, you ultimately publish, was it Amazon? And it's obvious Dirk obviously on Amazon now. Was that where you originally
Yeah.
self-published? Yeah. And how did you ended up kind of you took out some ads, right? Not to go into the gory details of this. I just think it's kind of interesting to chart the almost 10-year history of the book and how and obviously it has a happy ending in that I do think it's probably sold a lot better over the past couple of years, which you can get to. But yeah, what were your
Yeah.
kind of early attempts to get the word out there like?
Initially, I would approach bloggers, or
Good tactic probably, but yeah.
yeah. Well, you try to think, I think you were saying, Dan, with the submission process that um how it helps with queries. You kind of have to think, well, who would care about this?
Yeah.
Why should someone give a damn about this? And who are those people and what would they like about it? And you try to like find where who are the sort of people who might be interested in this story. And there were all these guys in the manosphere like Forney, who were writing, and he was doing reviews. And I thought, well, maybe he'll take a look. Or there were places like Takis.
Yeah.
And Ann Sturzinger, who she gave me a really good review.
Yeah, that review's still up. That's where I know some of the context.
Yeah, she's a cool lady.
Read that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was one of these people who was there at this sort of change, like you were talking about, Matt, who's seeing the publishing industry, but there's also this rise of self-published authors, and it's like, well, why aren't these people getting published? And she was one of the people who were trying to figure that out. And this is back in 2014, I guess. And so I initially would try to chase down reviews. And I think I took out some ads maybe on Reddit and some other thing. I did a giveaway on Goodreads, and I was just trying to think of anything I could to try to get it out. I would also approach some journalists, I'd approach journalists, but I would also some of these like news magazines that were starting to transition to web-based formats, and I would send inquiries to them. And some, I won't say who it was, but it was one of these these web magazines. They're saying like we don't do book reviews, but thank you for thinking of us. And I was thinking like, Huffington Post at the time, or BuzzFeed, or whatever was going on at the time, they do book reviews. And like how that's a tremendous blind spot. And I think that was completely indicative of kind of the sort of, I guess, a conservative establishment at the time. Yeah. It was like, well, we don't want to engage in the culture. We don't want to we don't want to do movie reviews or book reviews outside of bitching about what leftists just did.
Yeah.
And they have no kind of positive vision or trying to find out, well, who's advancing the sort of stories we want told? Because people were already out there doing it in mainstream and publishing houses, but you won't hear about them. I mean, I think of one of my favorite. I enjoy fantasy and sci-fi, and I should probably give some like high tone sort of like books that I like. But I like that stuff. Yeah. And one of my favorites, I remember coming across Larry Correa, who's like a self-proclaimed right-wing Mormon gun nut. Mm-hmm. He was like an accountant who was working in a gun store, and he was really into B movies, and he wrote this basically an urban fantasy where you have like these private military contractors who collect bounty for killing monsters, and one of them, the Monster Hunter International, is headquartered out of Alabama. And this is like, and it's a fun story. Or Jim Butcher, who I think he's pitched his book at Hollywood as like a dirty Harry Potter. And this guy, it's like Spencer for Hire as this private investigator who's a wizard in Chicago, and he like gets in adventures, and it's like he's basically playing D&D with himself. But it's like it's fun, and you have characters who are doing cool stuff, and there's no nobody's Breitbart's not doing a review over Jim Butcher's new book. And when Butcher's he's like an old-fashioned libertarian from Missouri, or Larry Correa, they're not promoting his book. You have people who will the leftists will quote Harry Potter chapter and verse, but there are people who are already out there, but they don't want to talk about them, and they've got to get over that.
Yeah, well, and thankfully, I think that change has happened a bit. Obviously, in this space, this podcast, even like that's kind of part and parcel of this whole like dissident right, frog Twitter, whatever you call it, like corner of the internet. But honestly, even I don't know what Breitbart's doing, but like even I don't even like to praise this person much, but even like the Daily Caller, which I really hesitate to praise. I know we're used to shitting on Ben Shapiro, but even he has kind of, I think, he has a production company, which I mean, honestly, I'm not about to go out there and watch those movies necessarily because whatever, but like I do think I only bring up as an example because even the non-based corners of like conservatism, I think, are starting to realize that fighting on the playing field, the battlefield of culture, is worthwhile, and I think that there's been some successes and will be more.
Yeah, and I agree. I think everybody's kind of working it out right now, and I think it's an interesting time.
Well,
Yeah,
also
no,
that money
absolutely.
is being left on the table. That
Yeah.
people, people want to see conservative movies. People want to see more traditional stories, and obviously Netflix isn't making them. Obviously, the mainstream publishing industry, where every literary fiction novel is about like a Vietnamese immigrant, they're not making it. So, like, whether it comes from us and we suddenly start making money, well, that's great. I'd love that. Or whether it comes from, some Hollywood exec waking up, like, not that Amanda Milius is an exec exactly. She started her own studio, but she's producing movies too. Ben Shapiro, say what you will about him, he is producing movies. I mean, someone's gonna take home the prize.
Yeah.
Hopefully, many of us.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, you wrote about, and we did a podcast episode about, and you wrote about Top Gun Maverick for IM 1776. I think it could be overstated the extent to which that movie is conservative or right wing or traditionalist. But obviously, it was by far basically the most popular and best selling movie in years. Maybe one of the most best selling movies of all time. And we did enjoy the piece you wrote for IM 1776 on that. I don't know if you heard our episode on Top Gun. No
Yeah.
need. Oh, you
Oh,
did.
you
Okay.
did? You
Yeah.
listened?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, that was one of our favorites.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I was really struck while reading your article. Like, I feel like we independently kind of hit a lot of the same points. I mean, and that's my general take on Top Gun. It's like I don't want to overpraise it, but I do
Yeah.
think there's some key stuff in there that's really good.
Yeah, I wasn't even really into the first Top Gun whenever I was a kid. I remember my dad's really big about sneaking into movies. We would almost dread going to the movies with him,
Mm.
because it's like this is going to the movies with dad would be like an all day thing. And nobody's
Yeah.
he's this blue collar dude who's like you're some 18-year-old person who's an usher or whatever. You ain't gonna call him out. But I we went to go, he took me to see Transformers the movie. And I was blown away by that. Like my hero Optimus Prime had just died, and I'm going to get snuck into Top Gun. Like
Ah,
I'm not in the headspace for that. But it was always in the background, and there was that feel back then where something like that could be made, and it was cool.
yeah.
Sort of like or talking with Granza about Point Break. Like I love Point Break. That's such a fun movie. Or
Hmm.
and it's about and it's got that feel of what I assume like that you always see with movies in LA around that time. Um, and it's
Yeah.
also I think Die Hard has a bit of that.
Right. Oh, for sure.
And
Yeah.
so it was just cool, and this was just normal stuff that was taken for granted, and you could go see it in a movie, and like that disappeared at some point. And so to see something like this again, and it's as you say, like it's not really great. At least I wouldn't consider it great, but it's good and
Yeah.
it's fun, and it's just like it's something that used to be normal, and it's like seeing that after all these years, like whoa, like huh,
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah.
know they still did that.
Definitely.
How
I think
about
that
that?
was the sentiment. That's one of the word of mouth surrounding it, and why it sold so well is because like it really delivered on that. Like it would have sold well regardless because it's Tom Cruise, but people realized that like this was a sort of a throwback in a really positive way. And of course, there's enough solid lines within the first 5 minutes to warrant the whole thing with the whole your kind is going extinct
Yeah,
moment. But one thing I did want to specifically highlight, I think that I didn't remember that I'd done this until I was reading your Top Gun article like this week in prep for this episode. But I actually do think I reference you on our Top Gun episode
yeah,
with regard, and I was really pleased to see that you'd made the same point about the John Hamm character in Top Gun Maverick and how that kind of represented. I don't even think you necessarily say this per se in Dirt Cult, but you said it about Dirt Cult on BAP's podcast. I'm sure you've said it elsewhere that the sort of upper once you rise to a certain rank within the military, you seem to get some kind of globo homo lobotomy.
yeah,
If you
yeah,
want to unpack
absolutely.
that, yeah. In the context of Top Gun Maverick, obviously it's more just that John Hamm's this guy with a stick up his ass. He's more by the book, and Maverick's more instinctual. But like, I guess that isn't necessarily unrelated to some of the political globo homo stuff either, is it?
Yeah, but there was a kind of touch. This reminds me of something we got into a little bit earlier about this is, I suppose it's always been kind of a trope of military stuff going all the way back to early back to the phalanx, there's always this, this need to try to break things down into systems and processes because this is discipline. Some things work, some things don't, and you train accordingly. But I think the kind of that John Hamm character and how like that archetype really seems to come into play, or I guess really kind of comes into its own in like post World War II literature. At least I think of things like From Here to Eternity, or I mentioned Once an Eagle. Once an Eagle is this book by Anton Meyer that's like it's one of these like Marine Corps commandant reading list type books. I remember our LT was reading it in Afghanistan. I wound up reading it while I'm writing Dirt Cult, because I'm at this point, people always ask how you should write, and one of my favorite fantasy authors, Robert Jordan, who I've got problems with that with what happened to his stuff, but that's neither here nor there. But one of the things he would tell people is you need to read. And I think so. I was just obsessed reading as much stuff as I could, and I tried to get into that genre of post-war novels, and there's, well, I guess Catch-22 is probably the best example of that. But there's like with Once an Eagle, the protagonist, he's a young man in World War I out of Nebraska, and he enlists and he rises through the ranks, and by the end of it is an officer, and then he serves in World War II, and it follows all the way up to the beginnings of the Vietnam War, and he's front and center for this kind of change that happened as the old Army style, the sort of Teddy Roosevelt types of stuff, how that changed into this sort of managerial globo homo thing, where they're at one point, I think out west, it might have been California, and they're talking about how there's basically going to be a second World War, and they kind of take it for granted that this is going to happen. Like there's just this sense that, and one of the foils in the character, I think his name's Courtney Massengill, which is a really unfortunate name for a man. But he's the managerial guy. He's the guy who rises through the ranks because he's good at kissing ass or policy procedure and all that sort of stuff that really flourishes in like this sort of industrial or high tech bureaucracy that's the military. And so kind of bring that back, or one more example, I guess, is From Here to Eternity. Everybody thinks about that scene where Burt Lancaster is making out with that chick in the beach, but you read the book, it's here's this NCO, and he's a hard ass, and he's a tough guy, but he also knows how to work the machine. And and this is like this is right at the beginning of World War II, and so it's apparent there's this bureaucratization that's already happened, and it's about paperwork and this and that, and it's just the sense that you're on this runaway machine. And I think the John Hamm character, like he's a perfect archetype of that mindset that is in the military. Sorry about that.
No, absolutely. I appreciate all the references. I mean, one of the more generic questions we had on our list was like, what are some of your literary influences? So I'm glad to kind of hear about some of those. But no, definitely, it is kind of an archetype. But mine, based on your novel and other things I've heard, it's an archetype that it's a worthwhile archetype of the military bureaucrat with the stick up his ass, because it's true, and it really does chart a change that has occurred in the military, and that continues toward this managerialism. Another somewhat related to that, perhaps change within military and American life that Dan and I were talking about in prep for this episode was, and I think it's something that your novel speaks to a bit, and your other work as well, is the kind of changing perception and role of the veteran in American culture and society. Benjamin Braddock, in his review of Dirt Cult, made a really interesting point about how kind of back in the day, and obviously one reason for this was that the military is now a little more volunteer based than it was during World War II and Vietnam War era with the draft, but that it was a much more normalized thing. Like Clint Eastwood was in the military and then had an entertainment career. I'm trying to think, it was Clark Gable, maybe it was one, Elvis, obviously. There's all these examples. Like it was a much more sort of normalized thing where a lot of American men were in the service. Like that was just this normal thing. And
Jimmy Stewart, famously.
So many actors, so many musicians, and they were integrated into American life in a very depressing way that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Now there's this, our society is weird in how we treat veterans, to say the least. There's this sense that like there's almost a poverty to that role. Like there's this understanding that he probably joined in either A because he needed the money, or he was just weird and he wanted to go overseas. It just, I mean, have you kind of, does that resonate like that the changing perception? Obviously there's always going to be some sort of more Republican types who will praise veterans, but it's just this sad thing that's part and parcel of a more general atomization where it's there's not really a role for veterans within culture and society, which is a really shameful thing.
I think that's absolutely the case, and I don't know how much of that's Vietnam and how much isn't, but I think it plays a role. And there's or how much of that's even at the risk of sounding like a Marxist. I think there's an issue of class to this.
Of course there. No, I agree. It's not a Marxist thing. Yeah,
which I'm going to get on that in a second, but just to kind of tell a story. When I enlisted, again, this was 2000. 9/11 hadn't happened to kind of give us this boost of patriotism again and everything. There was the last big one we'd seen was maybe Vietnam. There'd been Somalia and some other things like that, and it was just really kind of nebulous, and you didn't really know what these things are over. And I remember I was going to tell my mom that I was going to enlist, and she winds up hitting me with a pillow. she's laid up because she just had a car accident, and so I go back into the room, my mom and dad's room, and I'm like, Mom, I need to talk to you. And she's like, she's a mom, and she just got confronted with her son about to drop something on her, and she's like, what the hell is this? And that's why I said I'm going to enlist. And then she hits me, and like she's like grabs a pillow and she hits me with it, and I don't think that woman has hit me since like maybe spanking me when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. She gets mad. She's like, I would have rather you have got some girl pregnant. she was thinking I was going to tell her like I got some girl pregnant, and so she finds out I'm going to go enlist. And another guy I wound up talking with at a friend's wedding had said like, why are you doing that? Like, and one of my Army buddies who's from New York. He's very much a man of the left, and we didn't really get along on terms of politics, but he was a good friend, and he was a comedian, and so he's coming out of like New York comedian kind of background, and he was saying one time that whenever he enlisted, he went in thinking like like a lot of people around him thought that the military it's this thing that we need, but it's filled with a lot of people that you really don't want to know. And whenever he enlisted, though, he realized it's filled with all these really cool people, or good dudes, who are very much worth knowing. And he wouldn't have seen that otherwise. And just I think for the sort of the taste makers of this sort of this thing that we live in now, I think they kind of have that attitude. We'll need these guys to go like fight and kill and die because of the stuff we want to do, but we really don't want to know them.
No, it's incredibly sad and shameful, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, and it kind of I think one of the central hypocrisies, or just frankly, as I said, disgusting things that you sort of call out in Dirt Cult, but then maybe even more so in some of your more recent, writing for IM 1776 and such, like your Ukraine article, is this, the total, the way that, and it's basically red state, flyover country men, less credentialed especially, are treated as totally disposable, which is bad in its own right. But then in the same breath that they're treated as disposable, they're also scapegoated for all of society's ills. And I don't think we're overstating this at all. I mean, I think that is the dynamic in the way that a certain elite talks about, about veterans, about men from certain areas of the country. And it's remarkable that how unaware a lot of these people are that is what they're doing.
Yeah, it's I guess it's the sort of myopia of these people who, if you're intelligent, they tell you need to go off to school and you need to go get these degrees, and then you go work in in an office or whatever. And a lot of these people are really insulated, and because that's all they've known. I mean, I've worked with at one point while I was working I worked with the VA, and you would work with some of these people who all they've done is be a doctor or whatever. And or you deal these people who just understand administration, and they've not really done these sort of they've not served in a line unit for a couple
Yeah.
of years, and they just sort of, like with the academics and stuff, they just sort of take it for granted that their class is right. That people like them are right, and should have more say, and that's always going to be the answer to these problems. Like the good old boys touch on, politics is patronage. And this
Yeah.
this managerial class, they just sort of assume they're good, but the trouble is they don't ever really get their ass on the grass,
Yeah.
or even want to accept that maybe we have things worth saying, or that we have opinions that might be a lot more valid than they want to give credit, because that's an indictment on their worldview. It means their worldview is wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't think they can accept that yet, but they're going to have to.
I think so too. I think, yeah. I mean, I'm not always completely optimistic about the future of politics and American politics, but I do think, people who are simply wrong and are out of touch with reality, eventually they're going to bonk their head on it. I mean, I think it's already happened to an extent, and I think it will happen more so.
Well, it's encouraging, and as bad as this Ukraine business is, and again, this is I would like to see them do more to try to de-escalate, although I know it's kind of they're not there yet. They're not ready to learn the lesson. But in the meantime, everything just seems like it's holding its breath. But
Yeah.
they can't do like they used to. Like with 9/11, there was still that sort of, this is our country, and we need to defend it. That horse is out of the barn.
Absolutely.
There's 20 years of guys like me, or of guys like you who saw this stuff, and we all know we're being betrayed, and we're being lied to by this machine, and like the people on the other side of our oaths don't believe in countries.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
There's
big.
a real disjunction, I think, in this age, due to ideology, due to many things, but I think you see a real disjunction due to the fact that we are now and have been for decades, a volunteer army.
Yeah.
Whereas in the past, even in Vietnam, we were a draft army. And so you had men from all different walks of life participating in the fighting. And that, I think, led to, also was a time in our country where, though changes were happening, they were not happening at the pace and with the level of detrimental effect that they're currently happening. And so you had, a more cohesive group of men, a more cohesive fighting force. But today you have with, an all volunteer army, which, many are led to volunteer because of economic reasons. And you have a class of bureaucrats on top of them, just a clear cultural divide between the men and the administrators, the men and the brass, and also a misalignment of interests, of fundamental interests. Their interests are for you to maybe not turn out very well.
Yeah.
Well, and there's this issue of the recruiting crisis that's been going around, and like this makes it to where they can't promote Globo Homo like they would like to, which is great. It's an impediment. They would like to roll over Ukraine. They would like to do all this other stuff, but they know they can't get the draw that they used to, and that's to say nothing of the fact that, like, good Lord, how big is the debt at this point? Like, does anybody even really care? Like we're not paying that off. That's their problem.
Yeah.
But it's just like this zombie thing that's on autopilot. And why would you, like, if you're serving it, and I've got dudes, I know dudes who are in, and they're in for their reasons. But they also understand that this thing, it doesn't love you. And as one dude I heard said, loving a country that hates you isn't patriotism, it's servitude. And I think that's true. And I think there's a lot of people who, and I think this is a thing that conservatives, or whatever that means anymore, are having to come to grips with, is that they want to love a country, and they want to, like, belong, and they don't want trouble. They just want to grill, man. But they can't, because nobody's going to leave you alone. And the stuff they do want to do, it's having you serve things that are completely opposed to your interests. And it's like they're going to have to deal with that. And and it's going to mean that the world's not going to go according to how they plan it. And as they learn that lesson, I think things are going to get real squirrely, as we're seeing.
Absolutely.
It's going to happen. Like, it's not like that utopia ain't going to happen. So you're going to have to like make do with us, whether you like it or not.
Because
and hopefully it's peaceful.
Oh, go on. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, hopefully it's peaceful.
It's peaceful.
No, I was going to say there's this fantasy that we could go back to an earlier era, an earlier time, where the kind of vision of the regime or whatever was not as misaligned with the visions of like the morals and the values of the of people like us.
Yeah, I think
but
so.
you can't really rewind that.
No,
it's like it's out there, and like even if like you win the next election, even if there's Trump in 2024, it's not going to change the universities. It's not going to change the New York Times. It's not going to change the major corporations.
In fact, they'll go even crazier.
They'll go even crazier. And so, there's no rewind button here. There's no recapture strategy, really. So, that's what we're trying to come to terms with, I think.
Well, and it's again kind of going back to our earlier point of these circles. This is men who are having to like we're sort of the ones who get it first, that like this order ain't your buddy, and so and we ain't going back to the way things work, so we're going to have to try to figure out a way to make do.
Absolutely.
And that's, I know, again, it's scary too, because this is some pretty dystopian stuff that's happened. I mean, good Lord, somebody had posted on car culture and how the Cash for Clunkers completely eviscerated it, and now we've got the what's his name, Jackoff Plane. I want to make sure I give credit. JJ the Jackoff Plane. But he talked about how you have the Clash for swig a beer for JJ the Jackoff Plane. He's a good dude. But you now have these vehicles like that damn tire pressure monitoring system, or my truck that I have now, the dashboard whatever went up to where I just want it to play my music. I want to be able to plug in my auxiliary cable and have it play my music, and it won't even do that right. And it's like almost $2,000, and I'm gonna, it's like a 6-month waiting list for the thing. And it's like all this shit on my truck I did not want. And it's like, that's just the vehicle. And it's like, what are you gonna do if you're 16 years old in high school? Like, how are you supposed to like get the bread together for a vehicle? And and that's just one thing. And we've got all this stuff, and you're like, God, how in the world are you supposed to make it tomorrow out of this? Because there was again, sort of cribbing from people on Twitter. It was a Linkola something or other had said like,
Penty Linkola.
Yeah. I was like, we're like quoting the meme people. And again, like, this is the importance of art. Like, memes are art. Like this is, these are ideas that are given breath in images or words or whatever. Like, this is magic.
Absolutely.
This is alchemy. And anyways, I'm gonna get lost in my own anecdote.
No, it's good. Yeah,
it's meme magic, as they say.
Yeah. He said one of the things that made America great was there was always a frontier that you could go off into to escape America, and I think that was part of what made it cool, was that you could go off into a frontier. If you go, maybe you could have a nice life in the city or whatever, but if you got a gut full of that, you could go out west, and. Or like my people come out of the Civil War, and a lot of that's what they did. They like, you know what, we've lost everything. So like, Mama, I'll send for you when I get the cabin built. And they go off and go west. The trouble is was it the 1880 something census? Like, the frontier is closed now.
Closing up the American frontier.
Yeah, we got we're was it quote Jack Donovan, no homo, but which again, he's another one of these guys who help homo stuff notwithstanding, like he blazed the trail. He was one of these authors, but you're kind of having to become the barbarians,
right? Absolutely.
And owning space.
No, that's what it all
swig a beer for Bat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I feel like we're getting close to winding down here, but before we do so, wanted to ask if you had, and Dirt Cult is a very singular and very personal work. So I mean, I don't know. Answer this however you will. But do you see yourself writing more books in the future? Are you working on anything now?
I'm actually working on a screenplay adaptation of
Oh
it.
my God. Oh,
Awesome.
great. Yeah.
There's some which has been kind of an interesting experience. There's a dude actually who I did sort of the similar thing I did with the book, and I would send it out to people in the slush pile or whatever, for producers or directors or actors or whatever. And sometimes people would respond. One dude I may tell y'all off off of
Yeah, no,
off
cool.
of the
Please.
show, but there was a dude who actually wrote me back. And I quote this guy's movie, like we quoted this dude's movie, and he's writing me back, and I was like, I really liked your book, and I'm like, whoa, could you give me some advice on writing a screenplay? And he gave me some really good advice, I thought, which was interesting. But he was saying that he's over the hill and blacklisted. So it's huh? Like, would you like to tell me more about that, please?
Uh,
But so I've got a screenplay, and I've been I'm working on revising it, and there's some people have expressed an interest. No checks have been cut. No, we don't have paperwork. But right now we're playing around with the screenplay, seeing what we can do
Great.
with
Well, I
it.
hope, yeah, and maybe
maybe
I'll ask you more
a
about this
certain
online.
daughter of a big Hollywood
No, no,
director.
no, no, no.
No, no.
No,
But
no.
no, maybe
Princess Milius is like it's she's got her own things going. I've not ever spoken with her, but which I hope good things from her. Um,
Yeah.
she's hysterical. She cracks me up.
yeah, she's
Oh
great. We hope
yeah.
to have
But
her on this pod at some point. But no,
Yeah.
interesting to hear on the screenplay. Well, we should talk more about it maybe offline if there's names involved. I do hope you know. I think I do think there's some people like who could potentially make it or like at least help get the screenplay in like tip top shape. And like I think there is, I've actually talked to people, I'm not that well connected, but like whenever people have asked me like what like frog Twitter stuff do you think would make good movie content, I have cited your book.
oh, well, thank
I
you.
really like I think it would lend itself so well and so clearly, and I think it also, and this also stands for the book in book form. I think it has more crossover appeal. I mean, it's not Bronze Age mindset where it's like very online. Well, I don't know if I would say that Bronze Age mindset's very online. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just it's very much for a specific audience. Whereas your book, I mean, I think even like normies uh could sort of read it and really get what you're saying without having to have any particular political proclivity. So I think absolutely it's good material for TV film, well, probably film. But and I'm really glad to hear that you are working on that. I wrote a screenplay of my novel too. I think it's an interesting step to take, and it's an interesting writing exercise. You kind of you have to kind of boil down to the most essential elements, but I think it can be really fun as well. So best of luck with that. I will probably ask you about it offline. Curious.
Oh, well, good luck
Yeah.
with yours too.
Thanks.
Now, is this your first screenplay? Or
No.
have you worked with those before?
Yeah, I've written screenplays before. I've never gotten anything made though. So
Still, it's
yeah,
as you say, it's an interesting medium. One of the things that the guy who I spoke with had said, you're ultimately telling a story in pictures, and he
yeah,
said
Yeah.
if you have to use words, and so in writing it in trying to write it that way, I thought it'd be I imagine if, and again this is a huge if because I don't know if it'll ever get made, but I think it'd be a fun kind of period piece for a lot of Zoomers and stuff coming up because I think there's
yeah.
Oh,
enough that
absolutely.
they could
Yeah.
see familiar, but it's no at that bar nobody's really looking at their phone.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like or we're using payphones or whatever, and they be like this dude's using a phone book, LOL.
100%. But another thing I would say is that in my it's not my somewhat limited knowledge of this, like you mentioned in the I think the Sturzinger piece and your kind of process of trying to get Dirt Cult published, there was this notion like, oh, the publishing industry doesn't want more war memoirs. I think that's the opposite in when it comes to like independent film. There's this understanding that like there's a whole swath of Americans who will watch anything that looks like a war movie.
Yeah.
So I think that could actually help that project out.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
tough needle to thread, especially nowadays. Like I mentioned with the Top Gun thing, and that's it's almost like from an alternate universe where
Yeah.
all this other stuff hadn't happened. Whereas in reality, that stuff did happen. How do you do a war movie when the machine that, or how do you do a war movie when patriotism itself is kind of,
Yeah.
it's a gamble not worth taking almost.
Right.
Or
Well,
at
of
least,
course, yeah. I mean, your war movie would be a quite subversive one, but nevertheless, that's
yeah.
what would probably be what people would think it would be when if they're clicking on like a streaming website or whatever the case might be. But
Yeah.
they can deliver the message all the more powerfully.
Yeah, I mean, and I would stand on having the scene of just the imagining the military to say, fuck your orders. Like that's going to go
Yeah.
over like a fart in church. But but I would like to see that. I like, this sort of subversiveness doesn't, which I'm not a transgressive guy by my nature, and I
Right.
don't like subversiveness because like in a different world, like a guy like me would just be like grilling with a wife and like a half dozen kids somewhere,
Mhm.
and like, you know what? Since I didn't prove the lover, I shall prove the villain.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah, totally.
like, you know what? I'm not going to this stooging for something that is completely against me. Like that's the wrong
Yeah.
answer, and I don't want to take it, and I don't want to hurt anybody either. And I think there's a lot of people who feel like that, and so I would think there's a place for that, or at least it's a conversation worth having, to borrow
I
their
think so
language.
too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think coming right on the heels of Top Gun, like that was proof in the pudding that there is a huge appetite for this. And furthermore, the success of Dirt Cult, like that gives you a track record where, okay, I think the mainstream publishing industry is like exceedingly woke to the point where like there's a clear divide between what we're doing and what they're doing.
Yeah.
But I think you do have some kind of more outside or independent filmmakers there. So like we mentioned Milius, but there's others too.
S.
There's
Craig Zoller.
yeah, S. Craig Zoller.
Yeah.
There's who knows, maybe Alex Lee Moyer wants to make a war movie.
Maybe. Well, it's just that there's a vibe shift.
Yeah,
As
right.
y'all have talked about. And this is conflict. And that expresses itself in war. And what does that even look like nowadays? Like, what does that even mean? And that's real dicey stuff. But I think there's also potential for magic in that. In using these stories to try to like plot out kind of where we're at and where we want to go.
Sam, I think if you want to sell this screenplay and get it produced, your next podcast hop is Red Scare.
Oh yeah, that'd be an interesting one.
Get on there with the girls, and your troubles will be over.
I don't know. We'll see.
Or they may just be beginning.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
Well,
thank you.
I think that's about a wrap. Unless you have anything else you want to add or plug, or Dan, if you have any other questions.
No, I think we covered a lot of great material here, so I'm
Yeah,
good to go.
This is a good one.
Well, I really appreciate y'all taking the time, and I appreciate y'all's work. As we were
Thanks.
talking before y'all started recording, this stuff matters. I mean, not necessarily my book, but like that books matter, and stories matter, and images matter, like the culture and the arts. Like this is this womb of where tomorrow's going to come from, and it'll happen here first.
Thank you.
And I think the fact that y'all are exploring that, I think that's important, and I think it matters. And so I appreciate y'all's work, and I look forward to seeing what y'all do with this thing, and what sort of stuff y'all uncover to share with us.
Really,
I thank you for taking the time to invite me to come sit in with y'all.
Absolutely. No, I mean, you again, we've praised you a lot in this episode. We'll do it one more time. I mean, we talk about like some of the the telltale, the most important like red pill novels, and your book is definitely up there, mixing war memoir with just a story of day-to-day life, and just that gonzo almost perspective of where we are. I mean, it's par excellence the kind of novel that we look to cover here. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you for coming on, Sam.
Well, thank y'all.
Appreciate it.
All right, I'm gonna stop.